If someone asked you where you were from in 1970s Chicago, you didn't give them a street address. You told them your parish, St. Sabina's, Nativity of Our Lord, St. Francis of Assisi. That single answer told people everything they needed to know about you. Your ethnicity, your neighborhood, probably even which tavern your old man stopped at on Friday nights. For those of us who lived through it, 1970s Chicago was a city unlike anything that exists in America today. This was before gentrification smoothed out all the rough edges, before chain restaurants replaced the corner joints, before everybody stared at phones instead of talking to their neighbors. Chicago in the 70s was loud, it was gritty, it smelled like the stockyards on a hot day if you lived anywhere near the South Side. The Union stockyards that had made Chicago famous, Carl Sandburg's Hog Butcher for the World, they closed at midnight on Friday, July 30th, 1971. The yards had been operating since Christmas Day 1865 and had processed over 1 billion animals in that time. The steel mills were starting to lay people off. Manufacturing jobs were disappearing across the city. And yet, for all the challenges, Chicago retained something that most American cities have since lost: the feeling that a neighborhood was actually a community, not just a collection of buildings where strangers happened to sleep. The neighborhoods. Your parish was your identity. In 1970s Chicago, the Catholic parish system wasn't just about religion. It was the entire organizing structure of daily life. Archbishop James Quigley had aimed to establish a parish for every square mile of the city, and by the 70s, that system was deeply embedded in Chicago's DNA. Take Bridgeport on the South Side. This neighborhood produced 5 Chicago mayors, including Richard J. Daley himself, who attended Nativity of Our Lord Church at 37th and Union with his family. The population was predominantly Irish, but you also had Lithuanians, Poles, Italians, Croatians, all living within blocks of each other. One longtime resident described it. It was a hard neighborhood, but the important things were God, family, and work. In Daley's case, politics too. When the stockyards closed in 1971, Bridgeport took an economic hit. But the neighborhood held together because that's what Chicago neighborhoods did. You didn't abandon your block just because times got tough. Your parents were buried in the parish cemetery. Your cousins lived 3 streets over. This was home. Just west of where the stockyards stood was a neighborhood called Back of the Yards. Within roughly 1 square mile, residents could choose between 11 different Catholic churches. 2 Polish, 1 Lithuanian, 1 Italian, 2 German, 1 Slovak, 1 Croatian, 2 Irish, and 1 Bohemian. Each ethnic group maintained its own church, its own school, its own social clubs. The priests were often brought over directly from the old country. This wasn't some melting pot where everyone blended together. This was a city of distinct communities living side by side, respecting each other's differences while maintaining their own traditions. Over in Pilsen, the neighborhood was transforming. Originally Czech, named after the city of Plzeň in Czechoslovakia, by the 70s it was becoming predominantly Mexican. St. Francis of Assisi Parish at 813 West Roosevelt Road started offering Spanish language services and Our Lady of Guadalupe novenas. The community spread west into what would become Little Village. That arch over 26th Street marking the entrance to La Villita became the gateway to Mexican Chicago. And then there was Lincoln Park. Back in the 50s and 60s, it ranked in the bottom quarter for income. It housed Chicago's first Puerto Rican immigrants. The Young Lords organization fought against displacement. But by the early 70s, the rehabbers were moving in, fixing up old Victorian houses. Over half the adults in parts of Lincoln Park had college degrees by then, compared to just 8% citywide. This was the beginning of gentrification, a word most people hadn't even heard yet. The food, more than just eating. You cannot talk about 1970s Chicago without talking about the food. And I don't mean fancy restaurants, I mean the foods that defined the city's working class identity. Deep dish pizza had been invented back in 1943 at Pizzeria Uno on East Ohio Street. For decades, everybody credited Ike Sewell with creating it. But pizza historian Peter Regas spent over a decade researching the real story and discovered that a man named Rick Ricardo, born Richard Novaretti, was actually the creator. Sewell was a Texas liquor distributor who came in as an investor a few months later. The original deep dish was only about an inch tall, half the height of what you get today. On March 17, 1971, Lou Malnati and his wife Jean opened the first Lou Malnati's Pizzeria in Lincolnwood, Illinois. Lou had learned the craft working with his father Rudy at Pizzeria Uno back in the 40s and 50s. Opening day was memorable for all the wrong reasons. A car crashed right through the dining room walls during dinner service. Lou always thought it was funny that an Italian should open a pizzeria in a Jewish neighborhood on an Irish holiday, but that was just Lou's style. He died of cancer in 1978, but his wife Joan and sons Mark and Rick kept the business going. Gino's East had opened in 1966, founded by two taxi drivers, Sam Levine and Fred Bartoli, who admitted they didn't know pizza from nothing. They hired a cook named Alice May Redmond away from a competitor. That famous graffiti on the walls? Started by accident when customers carved initials into the wooden tables. Management got smart and said, "Write on the walls instead of the furniture." The Chicago-style hot dog got its official specifications spread by Vienna Beef in the 70s. Vienna Beef had been around since the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. The standard Chicago dog, all beef Vienna, frank on a poppy seed bun, yellow mustard, neon green sweet pickle relish, chopped white onions, tomato wedges, a dill pickle spear, sport peppers, and celery salt. And no ketchup. That rule actually started during the Depression at a place called Fluky's, which invented the drag through the garden combination and sold it for a nickel. Superdog out at Milwaukee, and Devon had been serving since May 1948. Maury and Florrie Berman opened it as newlyweds. Maury was trying to pay for his Northwestern tuition. Those 12-foot-tall hot dog statues on the roof? Maury built them himself out of paper mache over chicken wire. When they decided to stay open year-round in 1950, he coated them in fiberglass. A Superdog with fries and a drink cost 32 cents in 1948. The Berman family still owns it today. Gene and Jude's in River Grove has maybe the best origin story of any Chicago food joint. The founder, Gene Mormino, lost his original Chicago hot dog stand in a card game in 1949. So he started over in River Grove in 1950 with his friend Jude DeSantis. Their motto? No seats, no ketchup, no pretense, no nonsense. Italian beef wasn't actually that popular citywide until the 1970s. The Chicago Tribune reported it was relatively unknown in the 50s and 60s. The sandwich originated at what they called peanut weddings, budget wedding receptions where Italian immigrants stretched cheap cuts of beef to feed large crowds. Al's Italian Beef opened in 1938 on Taylor Street. Sports, heartbreak, and hope. If you lived in Chicago in the 1970s, sports was part of your identity, even though the teams mostly broke your heart. The Bears drafted a running back out of Jackson State with the 4th overall pick in 1975. His name was Walter Payton. His rookie season started terribly, 0 net rushing yards on 8 attempts in his first game. But by 1976, he was a star with 1,290 yards and 13 touchdowns. Then came 1977. Payton won NFL MVP after rushing for 1,152 yards. On November 20th, 1977, Payton set an NFL single-game rushing record with 275 yards on 40 carries against the Minnesota Vikings at Soldier Field. The Bears won 10-7, with Payton scoring the only touchdown. He did this while suffering from a 101-degree fever and flu-like symptoms. Before the game, he was lying on the locker room floor, shivering. That record stood for 23 years until Corey Dillon broke it in 2000. The Bears made the playoffs that year for the first time in 14 years. Over at Wrigley Field, there were no lights. Wouldn't be until 1988. Every game was a day game, which created something unique in those left field bleachers. The Bleacher Bums, students, night shift workers, retirees, and folks who just didn't feel like going to their jobs, they turned Cubs baseball into their own culture. Yellow hard hats, custom songs for the players. A bleacher seat cost $1. Grandstand seats were $1.75. Fergie Jenkins won the NL Cy Young Award in 1971 with 24 wins, 30 complete games, and 325 innings pitched. Billy Williams hit 42 home runs in 1970, the first Cub to hit 40 since Ernie Banks in 1960. But they never won. That was the story of Cubs baseball in the 70s. The White Sox nearly moved to Seattle before Bill Veeck bought them on December 16, 1975, for approximately $9.5 million. The previous season, attendance was only 495,000. Veeck was a showman. In August 1976, the Sox became the first and only MLB team to wear shorts on the field. He brought back 52-year-old Minnie Minoso for 8 at-bats just so Minoso could claim he'd played in 4 decades. Veeck created a tradition that lives on today. He secretly placed a microphone in Harry Caray's broadcast booth during the 7th inning stretch, broadcasting Caray singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" to the whole stadium. The 1977 Southside Hitmen, Richie Zisk, Oscar Gamble with that famous afro, Eric Soderholm, they hit 192 home runs, a franchise record that stood until 1996. They finished 90-72. They popularized the curtain call, players coming out of the dugout to acknowledge fans after home runs. Kansas City players called it Bush League. Chicago fans loved it. The decade ended with Disco Demolition Night on July 12, 1979. Morning DJ Steve Dahl from WLUP brought his Disco Sucks campaign to Comiskey Park. Admission was 98 cents with a disco record. WLUP was 97.9 on the dial. They expected 20,000 people. Over 50,000 showed up. Between games of a doubleheader against Detroit, they blew up a crate of disco records in center field. Between 5,000 and 7,000 fans stormed the field, started bonfires, tore up the turf. Game 2 was forfeited to Detroit, the last forfeit in Major League history. The Sears Tower and Everyday Life. On May 3, 1973, the Sears Tower topped out at 1,151 feet, the tallest building in the world. It cost approximately $150 million to build. The Sky Deck opened in 1974 on the 103rd floor. For Chicagoans, this mattered. New York had the Empire State Building for 40 years. Now Chicago had something taller. The Sears Tower held that title for nearly 25 years. Getting around meant riding the L. Back then, the lines had names, not colors. That didn't change until 1993. You had the North Side Main Line, the Ravenswood Line, the Dan Ryan Line. Base fare was 45 cents with a 10-cent transfer. If you were a kid in Chicago in the 70s, you watched Bozo's Circus on WGN. Bob Bell played Bozo from 1960 to 1984. The Grand Prize game, where kids threw balls into numbered buckets, was so popular that the waiting list for studio audience tickets stretched 7 to 10 years. Mornings meant Ray Rayner and His Friends, which ran until 1980. His craft projects were famously terrible. He wore a jumpsuit covered in paper reminder notes. He had a duck named Chelveston that he fed lettuce to keep it from biting him. News anchors Bill Curtis and Walter Jacobson were paired at WBBM TV Channel 2 in 1973 and dominated ratings through the early 1980s, taking their newscast from worst to first. Daley and the end of an era. Richard J. Daley had run Chicago since 1955. He controlled approximately 40,000 patronage jobs through his dual role as mayor and chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. If you wanted city work, you worked for the Democratic Party first. The precinct captains got out the vote, and in return, their people got hired. The 1968 Democratic Convention had damaged Chicago's reputation, police beating protesters in front of the Conrad Hilton, while crowds chanted, "The whole world is watching." The Federal Walker Report officially called it a police riot. But Daley held on. He was re-elected for a 6th term in 1975. On December 20, 1976, Daley collapsed while on his way to lunch and was rushed to his private physician's office at 900 North Michigan Avenue. He had suffered a massive heart attack and was pronounced dead at 2:55 p.m. He was 74 years old. His funeral was held at Nativity of Our Lord Catholic Church in Bridgeport, the church he had attended since childhood. An estimated 100,000 people filed past his coffin. After a dispute over succession, the city council installed Michael Bilandic as acting mayor on December 28th. Bilandic created Chicago Fest in 1977, the first big music festival at Navy Pier. Then came the blizzard of 1979, January 12 through 14. Forecasters predicted 2 to 4 inches. Chicago got 20.3 inches of snow in 38 hours. On top of 7 to 10 inches already on the ground from a New Year's Eve storm, the snow depth peaked at 29 inches. O'Hare Airport closed for 96 hours. Snow remained on the ground until March 6th, 51 days. Combined with other storms, the winter of 1978-79 produced 88.4 inches of snow, a record season. Bilandic's response to the blizzard was widely criticized. Side streets remained unplowed for days. Jane Byrne ran against Bilandic in the Democratic primary that February, capitalizing on the botched response. She won. Chicago would elect its first female mayor. Closing. The 1970s weren't easy for Chicago. The city lost population, factories closed, crime rose, but here's what people who lived through it remember. The neighborhoods that functioned like villages, the food that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't, the sports teams that broke your heart but gave you something to believe in. The sense that you belonged somewhere and that somewhere belonged to you. What made 1970s Chicago special wasn't that it was perfect, it was that it was real. The neighborhoods had character because the people in them had roots. The food was good because people took pride in what they made. The city worked because people showed up and did their jobs, whether that meant driving a bus, working the steel mills, or running a precinct. That was 1970s Chicago. And for those of us who remember it, that's something we've been looking for ever since. If any of this brought back memories, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. What do you remember about Chicago in the 70s? What neighborhood were you from? What parish? This was a look back. Thanks for watching.